Then the second sponsor is UpCloud. So UpCloud positions themselves on the market as the fastest cloud out there, and that's basically their main selling point with network of CDNs. And they have a promo code for us. So I see some people taking pictures already. So UC25 will give you $25 initial balance, plus there will be some super trial to try out all the features for free for some time. I think we'll send codes in after email as well. And yeah, besides sponsors, I wanted to share a little story. Actually, let me open first my speaker notes so I don't forget important stuff here. Since it's opening Meetup of the season, and it's actually 4.5 years we're running React Amsterdam group. The group itself is a bit older than that. The very first one was organized not by myself, it was organized by Sander Spice. He did 2 events, and then he passed the group over to us. So the very first React Amsterdam was way back in 2015 when React wasn't much a thing. Like you can see by topics that people did just be talking about Flux being introduced on conferences. Obviously, I don't know, how many people remember what Flux is? Have ever somebody used Flux without Redux? Quite some. That's nice. Around like 20, maybe 15%. So yeah, I've been working with Sander Spice back then as well when he established React Amsterdam working at Liberty Global. Then when we jumped in, this is the very first picture I found from Meetup in 2016. So the very first Meetup was in 2015. Then a year after, we took over as GitNation. So maybe somebody will see yourselves there. I think I recognize at least a bunch of people who usually are visiting Meetups. The photos are super low res, probably not fancy as cameras yet out there, but that's something at least I could get. Then, together with the Meetup, our initial idea was to start a Meetup, and that's what we continue doing with each new conference. We always start with a Meetup. We always do a free Meetup that runs quarterly, always like forever free, forever open to everybody. And then we do a conference after a few runs of Meetup, after we establish some community. So that was the same intention with React Amsterdam. Our very first conference was in 2016. It was like in a small kind of garage thing, and I think it was called Black Cafe, and they have this kind of theater space. So it was really underground. So again, React. There was just 4 conferences in the world on React, and we've been one of them. Today, like this year, it's around 30 conferences. So you can imagine how the landscape changed over the course of 4 years. So this is a really nice photo of the first attendees of the first React Amsterdam ever. So if you see there yourself, really nice to have you here since quite some time. Next year, straight after the first edition, we had a bigger garage rented out. We still use it. It's like a huge, actually old ship engine factory, Chroma. So we still use it for the conference. And first year was 250 people. Second year, as you can see, there's been around 1,100 maybe in 2017. And since then, actually, we just onboarded this title of being actually the biggest React conference in the world. It's not the marketing slogan in terms of amount of people, in terms of the size of the venue. I think it's just the biggest one other, even also JavaScript conferences couldn't actually usually get. So we're proud of this, not because of the size, because of like our ego and stuff like this. It's because of the interaction we get. We invite also for free lots of different open source contributors, and when you visit the event, it's just so high concentration of people you see from all around the world, from online. You meet people from Twitter who you know only in the internet, because we have people from like more than 100 people from US, people from Australia, New Zealand, pretty much from all over the world. Next to talks format, we've been also introducing React Open Source Awards. We started with React Open Source Awards, then we had JavaScript Open Source Awards. This year we had posted the second one. So it's kind of Oscars for open source. So the most recent newcomers to open source, not the projects everybody knows. So there's no Babel, there's no Webpack, there's no obviously Redux or React itself. Only new projects like that picked up in the last year, and we repeat that tradition. And since this year, we actually onboarded a few more technologies. So it's not only run by us anymore. It was designed to be as an open foundation. And since this year, we also have Vue.js Open Source Awards hosted in London by a Vue conference in London, and React Native Open Source Awards will also happen later this year. So it's a pretty big thing, and the submission of projects is open, so you can go to opensourceosawards.com and you can submit any projects you liked in a recent year in open source, and then we'll evaluate them with the program committee, and judges will vote, and we'll be giving away some nice prizes at this stage, because we invite all the nominees to the conference. We at least try to get them tickets for some, we try to get some budget for flights, and we basically present them small trophies, really nice ones. I think we'll send some email after that. So, time flight, we did 4 conferences, at least 16 meetups of React Amsterdam. We do 4 more meetup groups, so we can time that by 4. But specifically React Amsterdam, at least 60 meetups, at least 100 speakers. It was quite hard to count, but every conference, like 25 speakers, meetup speakers, a huge number, especially considering how hard it is people to get on stage, and I totally get that. This is really stressful, but it's really nice that because of them we have occasion together and share knowledge and do networking, because meetups are about content, like 50% of content, and the other 50% is networking, meeting each other, discussing topics, like catching speakers to dig deeper on their presented topics. And the meetup group grew to almost 3,000 people already. So it's really a big one. Even like Amsterdam is pretty small compared to like big cities worldwide, but this number is really hard to beat. I only know that San Francisco, New York, and London have bigger groups. I don't think that any other cities have as big meetup groups, either on JS, either on React in general. So it's pretty good that we have such a huge engagement for a small city like Amsterdam. And next year we actually will have our immersive edition. We will have a 5th conference. We'll be getting like a huge cake probably. We'll try to invite all the previous speakers from previous conferences for free to get them in to reunite the whole family. And that's basically the occasion why I decided to tell the story, because I've never been doing this retrospective. So next to the story, next to celebrating longevity of the whole thing we're doing together as a community, the second important announcement I just want to hold on you for is the announcement of React Amsterdam 2020. So it's always mid-April every year. So this year it's not different. It's always between Easter's and King's Day. And this year it happened to be April 17th. It's one main conference day, plus we have 2 days of workshops, and actually a whole week of pre-party events. We'll likely do mini conferences like Reason mini conference, GraphQL mini conference. So those mini conferences coming for free just around the major event, React Amsterdam itself, the conference. We're doing some small facelift of our brand every year. We'll add more push, so you'll see more of this style over here. Just a small video I wanted to share, just because we invested so much time to actually work it out with video editors. I'll play that. I hope that there will be some sound. Let's try it. No. Hope the sound system is now not connected. Any issues to talk about with sound? No? Source code. Actually, another thing, I fixed the projector, right? I fixed everything now. This works. No. Alright, unfortunately I will need to skip that. I won't be trying to fight that. I would sing along, but yeah, I'm not a really good musician. But we also actually always had this flag thing. Also something that I forgot to mention this edition. We're into ships a lot, and every year we actually raise the flag. We have always a React Amsterdam pirate flag, and this year's actually theme was hooks, related to pirates and stuff. Yeah, I won't be going on much video as we don't have sound, and I highly suggest you just checking it out on react.amsterdam website. It's really fun. It has its own vibe, so you'll enjoy it, especially if you like Amsterdam vibe in general. And getting back to my presentation, just with a few more slides. One more exclusive thing that we haven't announced to anybody yet, and we just wanted to tell it first to the local community, to the regional community, is that we'll be transitioning slightly. The name will become React Summit, because the conference was already really global. Actually, the first year it was mostly local people from Netherlands. Last edition this year, we had around only 30%, maybe 25% of people from Netherlands. All the rest been from all around the world, and around 25% outside Europe. And we just wanted to highlight that fact that we're not local-only community. We're actually a really big community. And partially we did this because then Amsterdam said that, oh, React Amsterdam sounds like a really small local thing, but it's not. It's 1,500 people. Of course, it's based off our cozy community, but it's a lot better. It's a lot bigger, and we invite so much people into it. And part of updates, some insights about what's going on, shared exclusively over here the first time. We're also launching a really small batch of tickets. It's not public for anyone except people here in the room, and we'll send this link only to people who is in the React Amsterdam Meetup group. So there's just 20 tickets, super early bird. Just for reference, the last year's early bird, which is the second tier, so there's first super early bird and then early bird. So last year's early bird was sold out like in an hour. So this time we just pre-booked specifically just 20 tickets for this group. So this link will definitely go in email to all of you after that. The link will be active till end of the week, not more. And the actual huge announcement, like global announcement to all the rest, besides our local community, will come in October. And if somebody will manage to buy some of the first tickets here, like till the end of the day, till the after party, I have some 3 prizes. So this is one of the great things that have been coming out. It's a passport holder, passport of open source citizen. So I have 3 of these with me. So somebody will manage to get one of the first ever tickets for anniversary edition of React Amsterdam. Just catch me. I will be here, probably near the bar. And just so you know, I will check you online. I will present you the gift. That's it with all the intros. Sorry for taking a bit more time. Wasn't prepared much due to just lots of different full-time jobs, lots of different meetups. Without further ado, this is the agenda for the rest of the evening. The first talk will be presented by Alexei, then Deepak, and then Yves, the Code Sandbox hero. We'll do 3 talks, one after another, so no breaks in between. And then after the last talk, till 10, we'll have the bar open. So I highly encourage you to stay and hang out and chat with speakers, chat with your peers, and just use the networking part of the meetup. And hopefully the next speaker won't have. Alexei, where are you? Here. You can come on stage and start connecting to your thing. Hopefully we won't face any issues. And
Can you hear me well? No?
you'll need to speak into this mic. This is for recording exclusively, so we have 2 mics set up.
Oh, okay.
Not to miss any of your precious content.
Okay. Well.
So one last thing, just give it up for Alexei. He came from Moscow, right?
Right.
From Moscow, just to give this talk for you. It's really important.
Hey. So I use this mic, or I don't? Do. Okay.
People in here.
Okay, cool. All right, thanks. All right, thanks everyone. I'm here today to speak about hooks. And probably will just gonna talk who I am and what I do. Well, I am. My passion is around engineering plus design. I'm an engineer, but I'm really passionate about like combining design and bringing it up to the engineering. So I'm a strong believer that design should come first and then the engineering solutions. And I currently work at the company called Resume.io, and I feel like this event is really special for me because the company is actually Dutch, although I'm not based in the Netherlands. So I'm glad to be here. It's it's super cool to be here tonight. So yeah, we just 3 years old, but we have 4 million resumes online, and yeah, we're growing pretty fast. So you can find me online on Twitter at mlfrg or at GitHub molfrog. So you can reach me out there. Okay, so again about design, I feel like this is really a special topic for me because my wife and my wife is an architect. So what we do in our free time, so we tend to look for interesting buildings all around the world and visit them because we really enjoy the the constructivism or some minimalism or functionalism. And what's here today on the screen is this library called Vipuri library by a Finnish architect Alvar Aalto. And this library was built in 1930s. And what's interesting about it is this library was, this is actually a monument for the functionalism. And what functionalism states is that your building has a function to serve. So you don't build building because it just looks cool. You build building because you need something for people to use it, right? And in this particular library, the architect, he invented this system of the natural lighting. So as you can see here, this is the main hall of the library, and they don't have any artificial lights. They only use holes in the ceiling. And the form of these holes, such as that it's really convenient to read a book or just enjoy the atmosphere. So it's always a good light for reading. Another interesting thing is that there is also a speaking hall, and it's built that the form of the ceiling allows you to better speak. So it's has a really nice audio in there. And Alvar Aalto believed that the mission of an architect is to take fundamental materials such as light, air, or just building materials and turn them into a building. And it has to be with the harmony of our life. So it doesn't have to be completely separated from what we do. It has to be a union of nature resources in our lives. So I really think that this is the right way to build stuff. So the function of the building, like in this library, it's just a fulfillment of those elements. But let's get back to React, right? We're here today to touch a little bit of hooks, and hooks were introduced around a year ago. And they are considered to be like a building blocks of an interface logic. So fundamental elements that you take, you combine, and then you have an interface, right? So probably the most fundamental hook is useState, and you probably have heard of it. And it's older browser use reducer. And basically what it does, it allows you to subscribe on a primitive value changes, right? So you have one value, whenever it changes, the component just renders. So pretty simple. But what's cool about hooks is that they're composable. So they have this semantics that you can use everywhere. You can actually implement different behaviors, but the interface will stay the same. And so here in the picture, you can see that we have useState, but you also can implement some more complicated behaviors like global state that is shared across the components of the app, or local storage state. But the semantics is just the same. So I actually have a demo for you here. Let's see if it works. Okay. So so this is like a simple component that changes its state when I click on it, and I can actually have a grid of components, right? And when I click on one, we notice that it's just all separated states. It's not a single one. But I can actually replace the same logic with a different hook. and then get behavior like this. Or, for example, I can get even more complicated and tricky behavior like this one, like the state that is delayed. Like it is shared across components, but it also has some time, like delay in time. So yeah, let's get back to the slides. So what we're going to do today, we're going to look at the hooks in action, and we're going to build a fully functioning router for React. Why not? And it's going to be a real open source project that we're going to release by the end of this talk. And yeah, let's start looking at it. And before we start talking about hooks and like routing, let's just think about how routing in React was done historically. So probably you have you knew that like routing has changed over time. There was no just one single way of doing routing in React. And for example, this de facto library called React Router, you're all familiar with it. This library actually changed its API multiple times. And in the beginning, they had this way of describing routes as configuration. So basically, and I think that came from a backend development where you have one file where you describe all the routes of your app. And yeah, you just change in one place, you know what your app does, and that's quite handy. And but eventually, they realized that the UIs are, I think, a little bit more complicated than backend, right? So they decided that, well, we can introduce configs, but actually the applications can be different. They can have different sorts of navigation, sidebars, whatever. So they decided that they will just simplify an interface and turn it into something like this. So let's just take a simple component that takes a route string and renders or doesn't render some particular component. Okay, simple. And I think they did a pretty nice job by like introducing fewer constraints here, and by that they actually gave more freedom for developers. In the beginning, it wasn't super clear how to use it, but then people actually understood that, well, this is actually super powerful. We can use more out of router with that. And we're going to start probably with implementing our router with a simple core. I personally don't like to start with like big things. I like to split it into smaller things first. And we're going to start with the core. So when you think about routing in your apps, like basically, it's just a way to do something based on the current location in the browser tab, right? And we have this property called location.pathname, which is a standard. And a router is just an object that listens to it, and whenever it changes, it does some logic, right? It just re-renders the app and shows a page that is needed to be on the screen. But this sounds really similar, right? This is actually similar to what we talked in the beginning of the talk. This is like a hook semantics, right? When you subscribe on something, then you react. React, okay. So this is probably we can actually do the same thing. So let's introduce a hook called useLocation, and it will return a pair of values, a current location, and a setter for updating the current location, for navigating, actually. So same semantics. And how do we actually implement this? Well, let's just start from the top. And in order for it to re-render on changes, we have to use state, right? Because if you don't use state, the component will not be re-rendered. And so we introduce a state, and then we somehow subscribe and then update the state whenever location path name changes. And then we return this location back to our users. And we also provide a function that allows us to set a location with history push state, which is a standard API for doing ASPA navigation. All right, so how do we actually subscribe on changes? Well, in order to do that, we can use a hook called useEffect, and which is basically a thing that allows you to do something on mount and do something on unmount, basically. But it's more complicated, but basically this thing just allows you to subscribe to something in the component. But notice there's a second parameter here, which is a empty array. And the pro tip of hooks, always specify dependencies in useEffect. And some other hooks. We'll get back to it, but just please remember that we have to specify an empty array here. It will be clear soon. All right, so this is the second hook from our list, and it's just a way to use subscriptions in components. And another function is it is basically a replacement for lifecycle hooks in functional components. Excuse me. Yes, so, but the thing is, we still have to subscribe on push state or replace state, which are the standard methods for navigation. And how do we do that? Unfortunately, there is no clear way to subscribe. There is no browser API for that. So you have two options. First one is you just monkey patch these methods. Doesn't sound pretty nice, but okay, that's an option. Second way is to actually intercept click on links. I know projects that use second approach, but I personally, I prefer to just pick the first one, which is easier, and I think I saw it somewhere, so let's just go with the first one. But it actually doesn't matter what we choose, but the thing is, at this stage, you probably, you already have a code, so you need to ensure that it doesn't break if you change the implementation of that. And yeah, maybe we can just wrap it in a component somehow, and you actually don't have to do that boilerplate. There is an existing library that allows you to do that. So React hooks testing library, just use that. You have methods for unmounting. You have a result. You can check, assert. Pretty convenient. All right, but how do we, now that we have a way to subscribe on URL changes, how do we actually do some pattern-based routing? And stuff like that. Like, what if you want to have some dynamic segments in your app? What if you want to have an ID of a user, which can be an arbitrary string? And yeah, so basically, the semantics of this is that we need something that returns a Boolean value and the array, like a hash of parameters. So this is just the design of this thing, right? So I need two things. First of all, I need a way to know if there was a match or not. And second of all, I need to somehow extract dynamic segment out of the URL, right? So this is how this could look, and eventually we can come up with a hook called useRoute. Why not? So let's actually implement this hook. And in order to do that, we can actually we don't have to write this logic from scratch. We can just use an existing solution. There is a library called path2regex with a long history. It powers libraries like Express and React routers. So just take it, and it allows you to transform dynamic segments into regular expression. Cool. So now that we have some way to use routing, how do we actually, this doesn't look really convenient, right? Like if we want to use some simple app with 3 pages, we can use this hook, but we also need to check if there was a match or not, return null, and then proceed. So this results in boilerplate, and we actually need some maybe more declarative way to do that. Let's design a component that allows you to do that, and we'll just copy the React routers one, the component that takes a string with a pattern and a component to render. Let's actually implement this now, and yeah, we just use the same thing. I will just want to outline that at the bottom of this code there is a method h, which is basically a create element in React. It allows you to add new props to basically construct a component, treat it as a vanilla JS6. Cool. So how do we actually now navigate? We now have a route, we have use location, we have use route, but we need some way for users to actually go back and forth pages. So we can introduce some component called link. And if we decide to implement link, we basically can just use location inside. We can use second parameter, which allows us to set the URL. And we just pass an additional, a customized on-click handler. And I would like to just outline that here I use the new hook called use callback, and which is not needed, but it's a good tip to use it, because this opens some doors to further optimizations into your app. So the semantics of this method is pretty much similar to useEffect, except that what it does, it caches the function that you provide based on some dependencies. Okay, so the third hook from the list, it basically uses to describe computed values that depend on other values. And here, I just wanted to show a diagram because when you're just starting out with hooks, you might actually, this is not really obvious what arguments should you use, and use this diagram. And if you don't specify dependencies, like you just forget to add an array in use callback or use effect, in this case, just remember that the value will be always stale. So it will be recomputed all the time. So it's not really optimized. So don't forget to pass an empty array if you want a value to be computed just once. But if you pass like some dependencies, the value will be recomputed only when one of the dependencies changes. Cool, but we also need some way to have, we need some development experience, right? We need for our developers to have multiple ways to specify a link. What if I want to have a class name, or what if I want to have my own link component? So we can design these 3 forms of using a link. And in order to implement this, you can actually use clone element, which is from the React package. Use clone element, and it allows you to take an existing element and append some props and override them. This is really efficient, so don't worry about the optimizations. It will be okay. All right, so finally, we need some way to have an exclusive routing. And by that, I mean, what if you have multiple pages, but they have overlapping conditions? Like what if you want to have also a default fallback route, which is rendered when nothing matches, right? And it works like that. You have we have first route in the list. We wrap it with switch, and switch always guarantees that the first matched route is rendered. So in this case, user/all first match, user/some number ID second match, and also path to regex allows you to have these dynamic segments, like default segments, sort of say, where the parameter can consist of multiple slashes inside. So, which is quite handy for default routing. Okay, so I'm not going to show how switch is implemented, except that we'll just go through the basic structure. Basically, what you need is take children, iterate over them, see if it matches, and just render it. But also don't forget about use this isValid element. Quite handy if you need to filter out things like strings, basically no components. And this pretty much mimics the implementation of switch from React Router. Cool. Now there is a problem. The problem is our router is 2.2 kilobytes already, but we just don't have any functionality. It's pretty simple. So why so? And the reason is because path to regex consumes around 65% of the library. Well, in normal situation, I would say okay, let's forget about it and just use path to regex. But I decided to go a little bit further, and I thought, well, do I actually need all the functionality that path to regex provides? Because, well, yes, it obviously powers Express, and Express has all these different scenarios, but I don't need it. I just need some way for people to use it, right? I need some most common scenarios that people will face while they're building interfaces, right? Their apps. And basically, the path to regex can be case sensitive, case insensitive. It can match part of the string. We don't need that. Let's just think that it's all case insensitive. It always matches the entire string. Now, path to regex also has type parameters. Well, let's just leave it to users. Let them see if it's really a string or a number or not. So we don't need that. We can just throw it away. And also they have nameless parameters. Yeah, we probably don't need that because we can have modifiers like asterisks, like we saw on the slide with switch. Okay, so long story short, I spent a night looking at how path to regex, what path to regex generates. I did some reverse engineering. I ended up with some really complicated regular expressions, but I was able to shrink it down to 1 kilobyte. Cool. Yes. You can see you can check out the issue if you're interested how it's implemented. But anyway, another thing is if you're building libraries like I do, or even if you're just working on some projects and if you care about speed and the size of your package, I think the good rule of thumb is always like keep an eye on like how fat is your library. And in order to do that, there is a tool called size limit, which is basically a thing that you include in package.json. You specify some limits, some constraints, and this thing always checks that your library meets the constraints. So pretty nice one. I all encourage you to check it out after the talk. Cool. But the problem now is, what if some people, because we already have running product, right? We already launched an MVP. What if there are still some like existing customers that who are using the matcher? And anyway, it would be nice to have some kind of a backwards compatibility with the original path regex matcher. And we can probably introduce that by designing some sort of like top-level router component. So our developers can just use and pass custom matchers to it. And if they do, then this matcher is used instead of the default one. But also, let's just agree that this thing should be optional, right? It shouldn't be always in there, because who likes routers top level? No. So let's just keep it for only advanced users. Now, how do we actually implement this? And the answer is, well, we can, basically we can just pass it as a context, but we also need to ensure that the router we're building, so we need some way to like, some internal objects where we keep all settings. We also need to ensure that this thing doesn't change between renders. What if the entire app mounts and unmounts and mounts again? We need to ensure that it only when it updates, only constructed ones. So in order to do that, we can just introduce some kind of a temp state in this router component. And in order to do that, we can use ref hook. So the use ref hook is just a thing that allows you to keep some values between renders. And it has current property. You can assign it. You can use it between renders. Pretty nice. Yeah, so this is the fourth hook from the list. And basically just a replacement for this attribute. Now we need some way to access the router and the settings from any arbitrary component, like from any other hook. How do we do that? Well, we can actually use context for that. And we can use the hook called use context, yes. And what it does, it lets you take a value from the context and use it. And whenever it changes, the component just renders. Pretty similar to useState, except that it doesn't have a setter function. Now, so we here can write a hook called useRouter, uses context, and also take a look at the return value. There is one trick that allows us to have like top-level router as an optional component. So what if we don't have it and the context in this case null? So in this case, we always like construct it like when needed. But there is a problem with this implementation, and the problem is it's going to be constructed in every single hook that it's used in, and we don't want that. We always want to ensure that router, like this router object, is constructed once. So, like, how do we do that? And wouldn't it be nice if we had some way to, like, have some kind of a ref, but which is not like component scoped, but like app scoped. And in order to do that, there is a trick, another one, which I really love. And the trick is we can actually write a use global ref. And it will basically kind of look the same as use ref, but instead the reference will be shared across all the components of your app. And the only reason it works is because React context is cool. React context has this optional parameter that you can use when you construct context. And this value is used when nothing is provided. So if you don't wrap your app in provider, this value will be used. So this is kind of cool because we can use it we can subscribe to this context and then use it as a global reference. Nice. So now we actually have a nice extension point. So what if we don't want to customize a matcher function, but we can actually customize the hook itself that powers the location. And this opens a door for other types of routing. What if we want to we can implement hash-based routing, or we can implement routing that is persisted across all the pages. And let's look at the demo here. So right here I have a real website powered by our router, simple navigation, couple of pages, and two default routes, right? And what if I actually what if we replace the default use location hook with a different one? So this is how it works by default, right? So think about this as two separate tabs in your browser. So we have same website, but just separate navigation. But what if you're building something that should be shared across tabs? What if you want the readers to, what if you're actually building a presentation that should be always synced on all devices that it's streamed on? So we can write a synced hook that syncs it with some delay, right? Cool. And notice that we didn't rewrite our app. We just changed one function. And that's, I think, one of the best, coolest features of hooks. They are composable, they have the same semantics, and they are really foundational. All right, let's get back to the slides. Now, the extra section here is supporting React. And the reason we want to do that is because we want to work on two markets, right? We're building a product, we're building an open source project, so why not? We need more audience. And React is a good opportunity, in my opinion, to target more customers, to attract new blood. How do we do that? The problem is we cannot just let our users import it from the same package, because it should probably use React imports. By the way, React X, which is right now is a release candidate, has support for hooks, which is great. So the only thing we need is to just say that, well, if you use React, just use different exports. And we can do that by just providing, let's just take all React-related stuff and put it into a separate file. And we have this file different across implementations. But all of the rest will stay the same. And we'll just copy it on pre-publish. So this is more or less the structure of my project. And when I run pre-publish only script on npm before publishing, it just copies all the sources to React folder. Good. And also, additional thing is, keep in mind that in React there are some differences. So you'll always have to check every single line of code that it doesn't break, that it is compatible with both React and React. And in my case, the only thing that was different is that in React, children is always an array, and which is not the case in React, but can be fixed with this small one line of code. Nice. What did we get here during this talk? Well, first of all, we have met some hooks from the package. But there's just one hook left, right? And we didn't talk about it. And this is a bonus track. It's not, unfortunately, I couldn't just fit it into the router story because I just didn't know how to use it. So I will just show it anyway. The hook is called use imperative handle. In my opinion, this is the coolest one, but also the most dangerous one. So use it with precaution. Basically, it's a hook that allows you to do some imperative stuff with your components. And usually, you don't have to do that because you have state. So the good rule of thumb is always relying on state changes rather than ref manipulations. But there are still some cases when it's needed. And what if you have a component that renders a confetti on the screen and it just works with the canvas? I use this library called Canvas Confetti, right? It has an imperative API. It doesn't know anything about React. And I need some way to just trigger the confetti on the screen. So in this case, you wrap your component with forward ref so that you can get the ref. And you use imperative handle in order to extend the reference. And then then you define methods on it, and you can just run arbitrary imperative stuff on it. And we have a demo. Hope it works. Click. Okay. On your command. Okay. Boom. Yes, it worked. Fine. Yeah, I spent the entire morning implementing this, but I'm really proud of it. Cool. And another thing that we did today is we followed the journey of an open source library from the design till the final launch. And I think that this is really important because, if you don't have an open source projects, I think that's a great way to train yourself and know that you're not writing code because you just writing code. You're writing code because you want to fulfill someone's function. So keep it in mind, and always know that there are tricks that you can use from product approach. You can always run an MVP. You can always just fake some things, talk to your customers, stuff like that. So the project is real. You can go and start it. So hopefully you can reach 1,600 stars today, I hope. The name of the project is Wouter, which is, I think, super interesting because we are in the Netherlands, and Wouter is a real Dutch name. So I hope there are no Wouters in the audience, so no offense. But people like the name, so why not? And some play of words here. And finally, I'd like to mention that we always follow this top-down design principle. And I think this is really crucial when you design software. And this is where we can learn from architects that were active during the beginning of the last century or even earlier, that they knew how to do stuff that people use. So we actually use the same principle where form always goes after function. So keep in mind that functions first, know what you're building. And if you remember, with React Router, they also followed this. So they started with the function. They decided to change the API, give more freedom by introducing less constraints, by using fundamental components. And in our case, I think in the React ecosystem, it's nicely done by hooks. So thanks a lot for the talk. And there is a project repo that you can fork. You can go and create an issue. You can actually use it in your project. You can follow me on Twitter or just ask any questions related to the talk. And I also wanted to say special thanks to Katya, who did such a nice illustrations for this talk. So she actually asked me to take a picture of me on stage with her illustrations. So if someone could do that, I would appreciate that, and just send me on Twitter. Cool, thanks. Yes, thank you for listening.
Right, thanks a lot, Alexei. So unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but we do have time for networking after the third talk. So hopefully, Alexei will stay around and answer your questions. Meanwhile, I'll invite selected for the talk, he did ask us and our volunteers to help him prepare the talk. So if you ever wanted to get some help preparing the talk, we're always happy to do it. Sadly, not much people asked for that help, and it's really good that Deepak did. And hopefully, Konstantin here and Evgeny, our volunteers, helped him to gain more confidence and prepare a better talk for you. And yeah, I think you're ready, right?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right. And so yeah, please welcome Deepak.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Deepak. I'm a front-end developer at Booking.com. You can find me on Twitter at debugpy. So today I'm going to be talking about modernizing a legacy code base using micro frontends. So before I get into the talk, first let's talk about, let me talk about the problems with legacy systems, right? So usually legacy systems are like very tightly coupled. A change in one part of the system leads something else to break. Usually these systems have a lot of accumulated technical debt over the years. So there's some developer has made some changes and probably has left the company. There's a lot of undocumented code. Usually these systems are monolith. While there are several advantages and disadvantages of monolith, the biggest disadvantage is a single deployment cycle. And also it leads to slow development, like you usually have to make some change, build the whole project, wait for the build to finish, and then only you can see the change. And this generally leads to bad developer experience. And whenever we encounter problems like this, the first kind of feeling that we have is rewrite all the code. And this is like a very natural reaction for engineers as well, mostly because writing code is way easier than reading someone else's code. I think all of us have can recognize with that feeling. But we must like fight this urge, because full rewrites are quite dangerous, because when you have when you're rewriting a product, the original product is also running in production, right? And then that product might have some bugs. It might have like new features that needs to be added, and this leads to like a big deviation between the old product and the new product, and you're constantly playing the catch-up game. So usually the management is aware of these risks, so it's also hard to convince them. There's this very interesting use case with Netscape Navigator where they tried to do this whole massive rewrite, and it took them like around 2 years, and finally they just lost the browser battle against Internet Explorer. I mean, okay, they rebranded themselves as Firefox, but that's a completely different story. So to combat this, we use this pattern called as Strangler Pattern, which was coined by Martin Fowler during one of his trips to Australia. So a strangler fig is this tree which grows around a tree, and it kind of starts taking the shape of the original tree slowly and slowly, while the tree inside just slowly dies out. So this is how it kind of looks like, the tree. And the Strangler pattern provides us a way to iteratively move a monolith into micro services, right? And this is kind of how it works. So you have you use something called as a Strangler facade to like abstract away the differences between the legacy and the modern systems. And then the system starts out small, so you have like both the legacy and the modern systems running side by side. And then the modern system is very small in size in the beginning, right? And then slowly it grows over time, while simultaneously the legacy systems become smaller and smaller, and ultimately it's just the modern system that is living. So the advantage of this over a rewrite is that you are just taking pieces from the old to the new, instead of waiting, you're building the new initially, and then you do a whole massive switch into the new, and then you don't know whether it's like a 0 or 1. It can fully break, it works wonderfully, like there are a lot of problems involved. So but this kind of provides a good way out of that. And micro frontends are basically microservices for frontend. They're like the microservice analog in the frontend, and we, by using micro frontends, we can use the Strangler pattern and apply it to the frontend world. So what are micro frontends? So at the base of it, they are route-based components. So you declare these components using routes, and then you can access them on your page by declaring them with these routes. So consider a page like this, where the white boxes represent the legacy system, and then the green boxes are the components that are built using your modern technical stack. So let's look at the like how it kind of works, right? So you have like a templating engine. It can be your PHP, your Perl layer. It can be your Node.js, like it can be like handlebar templating engine. It can be your Java engine, whatever. So what you do is, whenever this templating engine encounters one of these modern components, it makes a request to your modern your micro frontend service, right? And for each of these components, the micro frontend says, okay, here's the component, and it gives it back to the templating engine. And what the templating engine then does is it stitches it together in the whole page, and it sends it to the user. So now let's kind of zoom in to the interaction between the templating engine and the micro frontend service, right? And saying exactly what goes on between there. So the templating engine requests a micro frontend service saying that, okay, give me the component A at this route. And then the micro frontend service is responsible for giving it the whole component. So let's kind of zoom out and look at what a component is. So a component has a bunch of HTML that that represents some of the structure. You have some CSS that represents styles. You have JavaScript that represents some behavior. You also have some data that is coming from backend, right? So the micro frontend service is responsible for sending each of these individual pieces. Now let's look into detail on how it's done. So for HTML itself, I won't go into it in too much detail because it's just simple server-side rendering. You server-side render a React app, you get HTML. So let's look at the next problem, CSS and JavaScript. So before I get into how exactly we are building CSS and JavaScript, first let's look at how like the different strategies of building assets, right? So there are two trade-offs that we have to make whenever we have to bundle files, right? Whether we go with less files or we go with more files. So less files means that we get better compression, because to get good compression ratios, like the way compression works is it takes whatever is being repeated and it eliminates the repetitions. So to have more of the repetitions, you need to make sure that you have more text, right? So you can only achieve that by having fewer files. Also, less files means fewer requests, which means like less round trip time and everything. Yeah, okay, let's not get into HTTP2 now. But yeah, so it generally means that you have fewer requests. But more files means that you have better caching, right? Because whenever we split an application, we split it like usually maybe into app and vendor. So where vendor has like all the libraries you're using, like React, Redux, Moment.js, or whatever. And then you have your application code. And then whenever you make any changes to your application, you don't like your vendor bundle remains the same. So it is cached for the next time when the user is used. So then you have to decide, okay, now I have an app, do I split it further into multiple apps? Like, your a different entry point for search results, different for home page, whatever. So the more files you have, you get better caching that way. So just continuing on the same line of number of bundles, usually when we talk about standard apps, we optimize for reused bundles. We make sure that the maximum number of code is reused the next time the user comes on the same page. But for micro frontends, the concern is a bit different, because we don't know like from the get-go what are the files that would be requested at runtime, because the templating engine can request any component, right? So because of that, we need to optimize for loading only what is used by the user. So to do that, we use something called as dynamic imports, and then we use the loadable component library to do that. So what are dynamic imports? So dynamic imports basically is lazy loading JavaScript files. So instead of knowing upfront, like instead of declaring these script files in your HTML, you declare them in your JavaScript and then you load them dynamically. And we're using loadable component. There's also React lazy, but as you can see by this table, loadable components has way more features, so we go with that. Now let's look at some code. So imagine you have a component called other component, and then you want to include it. So what you'd first do is you wrap it around loadable, and then you use a dynamic import, and then you call it in your component. So as soon as you do this, these are the kind of files that are generated, right? So you have your client JS, vendor JS, and vendor CSS, and you also have your other component.chunk.js and other component.chunk.css. So as you can see, we have two classes of files. We have our bundles, and then we have our chunks, right? So the chunks are they correspond to the files that are dynamically imported. And the bundles are the ones that you statically say that, okay, these are my entry points, these are my vendors, and all of that stuff. And then, so once we get our files, now we have to make sure that we have to somehow send it to the user, right? So for that, what we do is we create a new instance of chunk extractor like this. This again comes from loadable. And then we get our HTML in this way. So we have render to string, and then we wrap our app around the chunk extractor manager, and we pass the extractor that we instantiated in the last slide. And then we get our CSS and JavaScript like this. So when the server-side rendering happens, loadable knows which are the chunks that correspond to the code path, right? So when we extract the CSS and JavaScript like this, it spits out like style tags and script tags that actually correspond, link tags, sorry, that actually correspond to the code. Now this is the tags with links in it. It's not actually the whole inline CSS or inline JavaScript. It's so it's just the tags with pointing to your script files which are hosted in CDN or whatever. So now let's go back to this diagram, and let's see what we have now. So we have our HTML, which was server-side rendered. We have a CSS, and we have a JavaScript, which we got from the loadable extractor. Now, once we have these things, the next natural course of action is to deal with data. But before we deal with data, we have to first look at these various concerns that come in. The biggest thing with data is that, first of all, we have to fetch the data that is needed, right? Whenever a component, like suppose we request for component A, we need to make sure that we get the data that component A needs. The second thing is we need to make sure that we merge the data from different components. So as you saw from this diagram, the templating engine can request for multiple components, right? So you can request for component A and component B. But both of these components are not aware of each other. But they might need the same data. So when that happens, we need to make sure that this data is merged together. The next thing we have to also do is we need to hydrate the data. We'll come back to what this is. And we also need to prevent refetching. If some data is fetched on the server, we need to make sure that it's not fetched on the client again. So let's first look at how do we fetch the data. So we do that using Redux. So we create a store. We wrap our app in a provider. And then whenever any calls are made, we make sure that the store is populated with the data. So now the store has all the data that we need. And now we have to send it to the client. So we do read store.getState, and then we wrap it around script tags, and then we pass it a unique data attribute. Let's call it data micro frontend store. So now we have a tag with our data in it for this component, right? And then we send it over to the client. So now we have HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and data. So everything that the component needs to be rendered is there. But there's still some work to be done on the client. The first most important problem is merging the data, right? Like we talked about, different components don't know about each other, same data. So we basically get the different instances of data by using a query selector. And then you run a reduce over it. So merge store instances is a custom logic function based on your business case. So you can define how these different data has to be merged. So then we get to hydrate, right? So hydrate, actually there's two things involved in hydration. So one is we need to make sure that all the data that we fetched on the server, we take that data and we initialize the application on the client with this data. And another part is we need to attach event handlers, because all the data that we loaded, like we just loaded the HTML, right? If there are any on-click events, like some interaction that needs to happen, that is not there currently. So for that, we need to attach event handlers. And to do that, we use two things. So loadable ready, which comes from loadable, and hydrate, which comes from React. So loadable ready runs when all the loadable components have loaded, and then you pass, you call hydrate, which actually you give it a DOM ref, so it hydrates your markup with event handlers. And you notice how I'm also passing the store over here. So the store data is what we got after merging the different data structures, and then this is what we pass over here. So at this point, our application is ready. So let's go over like a quick recap of what we talked about. So we saw how a full rewrite has several problems. We showed how a Strangler pattern provides a path for incremental change. We talked about how micro frontends are like components delivered over HTTP. We kind of took a zoom out and we saw how components are composed of HTML, CSS, and data. We saw different bundle optimization strategies for micro frontends, and we also saw how data in micro frontends can be served. So that's it. Thanks everyone for attending my talk.
Yves, and back to you.
Cool. Hello, everyone. First, I'd like to say that it's really cool to be here because tomorrow we're moving into this office, into TQ. So from tomorrow we'll be here. And this is my second week that I now live in Amsterdam. I moved here 1st of August, so I'm still looking for friends. So if anyone wants to become my friend, touch me after, well, poke me after this talk, and I'll consider you a friend. Okay, so my name is Yves van Hoorne, which is a very hard name to pronounce, even in the Netherlands. So you can call me Yves, you can call me Ives, and my friends have more trouble with my name than anyone else. They call me Flip. If you want to call me Flip, that's fine as well. I respond to it. I am co-founder of something called Code Sandbox. Who of you have heard of Code Sandbox before? Woo! Really cool. Nice. Even though it's quite known, I'm going to show the homepage because that's what I'm most proud of. I've worked for 3 days on this animation, so I promised myself to show it every time. So I was thinking for April 1st, I should make a soundboard or something in Code Sandbox that you can actually, well, have sounds when you click, my sounds. But this is Code Sandbox. It's kind of like your local editor. Oh no, an error. Gone. It's kind of like your local editor, but there's a preview here. So you can do typing, and it will update. And you can add NPM dependencies, and you have multiple files. And the idea is that we want to kind of have the exact same feeling as your local code editor, so that you don't have to learn 2 environments. So that's in a nutshell what Code Sandbox is. This talk, I want to talk about the story of Code Sandbox, how it came to be, how it started, how it came here. And in between, I will give some small demos and some technical explanations, I'd say. And whenever I'm on minute 20, can someone like put up their hand so I know when I'm on minute 20? We'll see. Okay, so let's start the story. 3 years back, I went to my first conference ever. It was called React Europe. And at the conference, I was new to everything. There were many talks, and the talks were mostly about what people built in the open source space. And I was super inspired by this whole ambience, like how people were building and showing everything. And I thought, oh, I want to contribute to the open source space as well. So 3 years back, I decided to, well, get my hands dirty. And I started writing notes. Every time I had a problem, I would think of a solution and I would write it down on this list. And that was mostly it. I, of course, didn't do anything with the ideas. I first started going on vacation. I went on vacation to a village called St. Ives, and you can guess why we went there. And while I was on vacation, I worked at a company. We were converting Ruby on Rails pages to React. And when I was there, I got a lot of questions from my coworkers about React in combination with Redux. So they sent me code snippets on Slack. We didn't even have code syntax highlighting. It was very bad. And I had to parse their code through my own head because I didn't have my laptop with me and think what the problem might be. So that was one of the problems that I then had. And I wrote down that it would be super cool if people could put these code snippets from their local editor in a browser where they have a URL that they can share with others, and then others can view it as well. So the question was, what if I put my local editor on the web? And of course, I put it right here, there. And again, I didn't do much with the idea. I started studying, and I started drinking a lot of beer, going to a lot of parties. The co-founder of Code Sandbox is also here. And this is me. But after a while, when I was doing more partying than really learning, I started to feel a bit unproductive. If you look at my contribution graph, this is when I started studying, and this part is just empty. And I felt unproductive, and it didn't feel very nice, so I decided that during specifically my Java lectures, I started working on one of the ideas, which was the first one, a browser React editor that allows you to create components instantly. It was a very vague description, So I started with a very vague design. It's in Sketch. It's called React Sandbox. It's one of the best designs I've ever made. And it was very simple. You had CSS here, JavaScript here, and then you have these buttons on the left, which were supposed to be components. And this would have been the preview. I didn't do long with the design. I just started trying to implement it. And I remember being super happy with this already. It was code, a preview, and when you change the code, it would actually update the preview instantly. I was so happy with this that I started to add more and more to it. So the next version, you have already multiple tabs. And the interesting behavior here is that if you import from the tab, then it would take that code and use that code instead. And it was a very simple implementation, I'd say. There were two applications. You have the code editor, and you have the preview. The preview is a separate application that's rendered in an iframe. Then, whenever you change something in the code editor, it would use post message to send all the files to the preview, and it will transpile, which is making the code readable by the browser, and then evaluate the code. And the implementation, I rebuilt the implementation in Code Sandbox to keep the inception levels high. So this is it. It's a bit different design. I didn't use Sketch this time to map it all out. But how it works is, this is the source code, the top one. This is the transpiled code. And this is a file, and this is the other file. It's a React application. And what I want to mostly cover on how it works is, it's also using hooks. I am very modern. And what I want to cover is run code. So run code, this is everything that was done to make the code evaluate. What happens is, we have an object which is called files, and it has keys for the file names, and then code as a string. It takes the code, it transforms this code, so it transpiles the code using Babel transform, and then it starts evaluating the code with the evil eval. So everyone is telling me, don't use eval. Well, Code Sandbox is built upon eval. That's next level hacker man. I'm very proud of this. So it will run the code. And the interesting thing here are these variables. You have require, exports, and module. These variables, since this code is evaled in this context, are available in the code itself. So if you look at this transpiled code, this is what it evaluates. It does a require, which will mean that it will call this function. And this function recursively calls run code again, and then does the same flow again. So the cool thing is that this will already work. When you call run, it says hello. Well, this is not applicable. React, one-hand typing. And it will do this. And the reason that it works is because it does this require here, and that require runs the code again, and it returns the module.exports. And if you look at this transpiled code, it does exports to agree this function, and that's what's returned. So that was in a nutshell how Code Sandbox worked. I started to do more UI work after this. So the next thing that I had as the idea was that you could build projects on Code Sandbox and then import those projects in other projects on Code Sandbox. It was very cool because you would make these like mini NPM libraries that you can then reuse. So everyone could build their own library on Code Sandbox and then you could see them in your actual project. But it turns out that this looks very much like your file explorer. So I decided to just make it a file explorer instead. The funny thing is that you can see that I didn't start with the idea of an online code editor. I started with the idea of some crazy stuff. And this is starting to look a bit like Code Sandbox already. It even now has the name Code Sandbox instead of React Sandbox. Then 12 days later, some Dutchies will know this cat. It normally says, aandacht! And this is already looking a lot like Code Sandbox. We got support for NPM dependencies here, which is dynamically downloaded from Unpackage at the time. And you can kind of see that it didn't start with the React editor as idea. It started with the component editor. That was the initial idea. Then a component library builder where you can re-implement libraries in your own library. And then I wanted to make it online so you can publish your library and then other people can import it. And then it started to become very complicated, so I just said, okay, well, let's make it an online React editor. Around this time, Bas joined as well. Bas is somewhere here as well. He's co-founder. There he is. We do every project together. We've known each other since we were 12. So, the idea is that I learned is that I should let the idea evolve. The final version of Code Sandbox was not thought of in the first version, so even if you have an idea, I would just start working on it and you'll figure out the details over time. Maybe you'll do an extremely big pivot of going from a component editor or component library builder to an online code editor. So 26th of January, it started to shape up. It was looking like a real editor. But then I lost motivation. Very, very useful. I saw Code Sandbox every day, and every day I started to get less impressed by it because I saw it every day, so it started to get very normal to me. So one of the things that I did then was I went back to the lectures because I stopped working on it, and my friends there, they asked me, hey, where have you been these past couple months? And that's when I showed them Code Sandbox, and they got much more enthusiastic about Code Sandbox than I was expecting. So that gave me a bit more motivation again. And you can see that I stopped working on it here. And I said to myself at that point, okay, we're going to work on Code Sandbox. We're going to try to finish every feature before the 1st of April. Every feature that's not finished by the 1st of April will be dropped. So naturally, you can see this huge spike of development. And a lot of features were actually dropped because on the 1st of April, not everything was finished. But we decided to release anyway. So there's the thing that I learned, that I should always seek for external feedback. In my case, I like seeing people use the product. I like people being enthusiastic, so that gives me motivation. I should also have tried to release faster. I was doing a lot of work on top, which in the end, some things were actually dropped from Code Sandbox, and it turns out that no one needed them, so I didn't re-implement them ever after. And follow KISS. Keep a simple approach. You can say, keep it simple, stupid, or you can say, keep it simple, stupid. And I like the latter version. For example, for the file system, I was thinking of like 5 different systems for the file system. Then I thought, oh, this is all over engineering. I should just put everything in a Postgres database. Now, 3 years later, we have more than 15 million files, and they're still all stored in a Postgres database. It sounds very scary. It works very well. So don't over-engineer. Keep a simple implementation. Over time, you can see based on the requirements what the actual implementation should be. Then I released it to, well, I had 60 followers at the time. So I created this tweet, and I got a whopping 6 likes, all from my high school friends. And they didn't even know they weren't even in coding. So it was very, yeah, that was a bummer. So I decided to post it on Reddit, and it got a lot more response there. And this is kind of when it kicked off. I started to do a lot of talking with people who were using it, and started writing Medium posts. And slowly over time, you could see people picking it up. That was super cool. This is one of my favorite things. Dan Abramov tweeted, when he still had this pink thing, he tweeted about how cool Code Sandbox was. I was so enthusiastic that I made a snap of it, like a Snapchat snap. You can see that because of this. This means this is so cool for the translation. And you can see that I sent this to all my high school friends again, and they didn't understand it. Then I also got feedback saying, marry me, I'm in love with you, this is delicious, thank you, I've included you in my will. I still need to find this person. And even at some point we were on Hacker Noon, and that made me super enthusiastic as well. So as you can imagine, I made this very scientific graph of how, as Code Sandbox got more popular, you could see that my past exams went down. I did pretty bad at my university, which others really didn't understand. I found it pretty hard to concentrate on learning math when I got like messages and people using Code Sandbox. So at some point I decided, what am I actually doing? And I decided to pause my studies. At that time, my excuse was to pause it. I'm still in a paused state of my studies, even though we have a company of 10 people. But I decided to pause it. And we started to write down some values because we're an open source project. We got a lot of feature requests, so we had to kind of categorize which feature requests, which features we wanted to implement as first thing. The first one is lower the learning curve. Second one is encourage sharing and discovery. And the third one is give a local editor experience trademark. And I want to explain the values and then give an explanation on how it kind of resolves in what's implemented in Code Sandbox. The first one is lower the learning curve. One of the things that I didn't really think of when releasing Code Sandbox is that people use it to learn web development on Code Sandbox. And that is super interesting. And it makes a lot of sense because people don't have to set up an environment before they can get started. They just have to go to a website, start editing the white text, and they've changed the web application. They can call themselves a developer, which is also my preferred way of learning. In the end, hopefully you don't spend most of your time in the build tools environment setting that up. And I think it makes sense to first actually taste how it is to build an application before you start learning how to, do the build tools. So that was really cool. One of the things that we do here that I find very nice is for some errors, because we have full control over the whole environment, we can detect everything. So for some of the things that we do, we change the errors to make them a bit more friendly. For example, if I would want to change this hello component to, I'll just change the import to hello. Normally you get this error, invalid character error, failed to execute create element on document, the tag name provided, blah, 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 blah. We have seen already that this file doesn't have an extension, so it's imported as a raw module. So we changed the error a bit, saying it seems like index.js is importing a raw module, hello, very Dutch. And we give a suggestion, rename hello to hello.js. And if you click it, it's renamed and it works. So that is one of the things that we do. We have this thing called error transformers where we use the environment, we catch an error and say like, oh, maybe we can actually provide something useful here. The second value is encourage sharing and discovery. So Code Sandbox was built for sharing, but it turns out that there is a gold mine of information on Code Sandbox. One of the things that we do is we have an embed, which allows Code Sandbox to be shared in articles, for example, on documentation. People can play with it and have some real feedback. But the thing that I find most interesting is our search page. So we have a search page which was broken at 5 p.m. today, and that's why I was very stressed. But we have a search page where you can see everything created on Code Sandbox. There are now 2.5 million sandboxes here. The cool thing is, if you want to learn like a library, you can get all the sandboxes of this library. For example, if you want to learn how Redux Thunk is implemented, you can filter on all the sandboxes that have been created with the Redux Thunk library. So you can use that as kind of like a reference point. And that's very interesting. There's a lot more that we want to do. One of the things is that we have an explore page where you can see cool creations. Like, I love this. And, this one is also cool. Ooh. Okay, next. The last one is local editor experience. There are two reasons that we want to have local editor experience. For the experienced developer, we don't want them to learn a new environment when they prototype something or want to share something on Code Sandbox. The second reason is that if a beginner starts to learn web development in Code Sandbox, if they at some point go local, we prefer that they also won't have to learn a new environment so that it all works the same. One of the things that we do is that this part is all VS Code. It's a literal implementation of, it's a literal port of VS Code. So what I want to do here, I want to quickly explain the story of how VS Code got implemented. It started with this announcement, themes. Sarah and I were attending a workshop of Sarah Drasner. She was using Night Owl as her editor theme, and we were thinking, wow, it would be super cool to also have Fiasco themes in Code Sandbox. So we started to look at Fiasco themes, and it turns out that the implementation of a Fiasco theme is a JSON file, which makes everything a bit easier. Because the thing that we were able to do here, we use styled components. We just put the whole theme file on as a context prop for the styled components implementation, and we were able to refer to the theme, and then with a small fallback. But this allowed us to put the JSON file on the context, and then you have multiple themes. Wait, maybe I can, well, I need 2 hands to do this. How do you, yeah, color theme, and you can use different themes. You have many. Whoa, I see everyone light up suddenly. But there was one problem and one challenge in this implementation. Who knows this icon? You do. Wow, that's very impressive. Okay, so this is a TextMate icon. TextMate was an incredibly popular editor for a very long time, especially in web development. And they introduced something called TM language. TM language is a specification of how code should be colored. So how code should be tokenized. So when you have a part of code saying it's like let A is 5, it would say let is a keyword, A variable name, 5 numeric. The challenge of this is, well, the cool thing here is that lots of editors after this also implemented this specification. So Atom uses this, Fiasco uses this, but there is a challenge here because TM language uses reg expressions which can only be parsed by a library called Oniguruma. Oniguruma is a C library, and we've been trying to first port it to the browser a year ago by converting the C code to JavaScript. It turns out to be 30 times slower, so your parsing, well, your syntax highlighting would be super slow. But we now live in modern times, and we have WebAssembly, and it was super cool because Nick Sandu, he made something called Onigasm. Yeah. It's a WebAssembly implementation of the C library, and it's actually very fast. It's almost as close as the C implementation, and I think at some point we'll get to the same performance. This is, by the way, small off-road thing. WebAssembly is super cool. I recommend anyone to learn Rust. It's also very cool. So yeah, WebAssembly is a small future. It will help with web application development a lot. Then when we released it, everyone was enthusiastic, but there was one person who said, what about extensions? I mean, it makes sense, right? You have Fiasco Themes support, so extensions must be only one small step forward. No, that's not true. With context, it would have been crazy to support extensions, especially since we have. I was doing a Facebook internship at the time as well. So I was full-time doing an internship and then also this, but of course, must be fun to try, so challenge accepted. I'll give you a very small crash course of how VS Code extensions work. So you have VS Code itself with its UI, and extensions are executed in a separate node process, the extension host. This has a lot of advantages and makes VS Code very fast because the VS Code people, they don't control what extensions do, so making them run in a separate host allows them to still keep like snappy behavior in VS Code itself while still allowing extensions. The other thing that's really cool is that they can just restart the extension host at any time without restarting VS Code. And the only thing that you'll notice is that for some moments you won't have auto-completions or you won't have go-to-dev additions. And the extension host can also spawn processes like TS server. So this is how VS Code extensions work. Now, making it work with Code Sandbox was a bit more challenging because Code Sandbox was not running VS Code. So the idea that I initially had was to create a bridge between the Code Sandbox and the extension host. So we would run the extension host in the browser, in a web worker, and then we would convert all the calls, all the messages from the extension host in Code Sandbox to something that would work in Code Sandbox. It turns out that there was so much work, especially if you have 4 hours a day. Converting every API call to a compatible version in Code Sandbox was too much work. So the next crazy thing was to actually run VS Code in Code Sandbox so that we wouldn't have to convert all the API calls and make it work. So that was the first crazy idea to try. And the first implementation went horribly wrong. The idea was, so this is how VS Code as the application works. It's an Electron process. So you have the main process, and the main process can spawn render processes. And this is actually what draws the UI. And all of these processes, the main and the renderer processes, have access to the native modules, which talk to the operating system like FS, Net, TTY, Module, HTTP, OS. My initial implementation was, let's stop all the modules. So try to make all the native modules work directly in the browser in Code Sandbox. Again, like the last implementation, this turned out to be too much work. Implementing file system in the browser, that's okay, but suddenly you talk about implementing Net and implementing TTY, and that was a lot of extra work. So the second implementation, I started to look into the code base of VS Code itself, and it's architected very C# like. It's very interesting. You have a lot of different services in VS Code. And all of these services are responsible for their own part of the system. So you have the editor service, which is responsible for rendering the editor. You have the file service for talking to FS. You have request service for doing requests. And these services, they can require each other in their construct. So these are all classes, and they can be dynamically injected. So the editor service might need a file service to get the file. File service might need a notification service to say that the file was not saved correctly, and so on. So my next implementation was the idea of creating a Code Sandbox service, which would talk to Code Sandbox, and then re-implementing these services and overriding them with their own version. And these services, they would use Code Sandbox. So let's say we have the file service, it talks to Code Sandbox to get the files instead of FS. The requirements of this implementation were that we shouldn't change any existing code because we wanted to stay up to date with the VS Code code base. So we wanted to keep the merge conflicts down. So the goal was to not change any code of VS Code. That was pretty hard. So we do have a few minimal changes, but the advantage is now that when we merge with the VS Code code base, it takes like, well, I think 2 days or something to catch up to 2 months of development on VS Code. And VS Code has a lot of development, the amount of commits. Every time you go to the repository of VS Code, someone at least made 1 commit in the last half hour. It's crazy. The second requirement was to expose VS Code as an API, so that when you have outside contributors looking at the Code Sandbox code base, they wouldn't have to learn VS Code to add like a menu item to VS Code. So we exposed, for example, the ability to add menu items to VS Code by just calling some code in Code Sandbox itself. And it should be fast and small. Electron applications, they don't need to do a lot of tree shaking or code splitting. In our case, it was needed. So we wrote a tree shaking implementation. Well, I wrote a tree shaking implementation of VS Code to look at which modules were used and which modules were not used. There are a lot of tricky things here. For example, React is declarative. VS Code is incredibly imperative. We use Webpack. VS Code uses AMD loader, for some people who still remember AMD. But the advantages are also big. It's updatable, so every time that VS Code has an update, we can merge it, we can take a day, and we'll have the new VS Code in Code Sandbox. We're not reinventing the wheel. I even found some new features in VS Code while implementing it in Code Sandbox, which is really cool. And you can stay familiar with the existing editor. We do now also have extension support, so it's still, you cannot install your custom extensions yet, but that's one of the plans in the future. But it works very much like your own editor. And this is the final implementation. And one of the cool things I always like to show is that it's so real that, okay. I can even, so you have to configure, oh, this can close. And you can move. So I can even take my existing configuration from my code editor, and I can paste it here and save. And it will change my editor to be like, well, and it will fork the sandbox, of course. And it will change my editor to be like my implementation of the base editor. And it works with key bindings, it works with your settings, it works with a lot of, we use the Vim extension from VS Code to have Vim support. So you can do a lot of things that are implemented here. And if you want to talk more about how VS Code extensions are implemented in Code Sandbox, that's a whole other story where we re-implement a small node runtime in a web worker. That's for at drinks, then I need a couple beers.
Yeah, that was crazy.
Yeah, that's a lot of work. And in the meantime, on the business side, we decided to grow the team. So we've raised an investment of $2.4 million from Kleiner Perkins and some really cool founders. For example, Koen from Framer, Dylan from Figma, the founders of Netlify, founder of Zeit, SourceGraph founder. So it's we have a lot of advisors, and we're now growing the team. So right now we're 9 people. The last 2 weeks we had a get-together of Code Sandbox. We're remote first, and from next month, so 1st of September, we'll be 10 people. And another thing that can be done in this scientific graph, that as more people start working on Code Sandbox, I start to work on code less. And I think this can be like a part 2 of this talk, about how suddenly you're shifting from doing a lot of coding to doing more writing documents instead in Notion. As though Bas is like the Notion master, so I'm still safe from that. But I still need to learn how to handle this, and that will be like for the next time, I think. So thanks a lot for listening. This is our cat, our student house cat, sitting on my keyboard, and now my keys are sticky. So it's a bad story, but it's a nice cat. Thanks a lot.